Hello, kindred, and welcome to the Retrograde Rumble, where I'll be knocking out retrograde ideas in the political sphere in as brief a time as possible. On today's installment, I'll be responding to certain points made during the talk between Jordan Peterson and Charlie Kirk on May 13th of this year. The link to that talk will be in the description. The first thing that I wanted to address is Charlie's belief that single motherhood has done the most harm to the black community. While I will preface my argument by saying that I don't believe that single-parent households are the best way to raise a family, something I came to believe by growing up in one, to say that single motherhood is the greatest root cause of the social ills of today's black community ignores many important factors. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's heard what conservatives have had to say about the black community for decades. When the aim in speaking about black single mothers hasn't been to paint them as lazy, irresponsible, baby-making welfare queens, the focus veers slightly off into blame the Great Society territory. Charlie plays along the edge by suggesting that they didn't marry out of fear of losing their government check. One could reasonably infer that he, identifying as a white Christian male and a conservative, has a blind spot when it comes to the societal importance of marriage. Though the history of marriage is a topic worthy of its own video, the part of it most relevant to Charlie's claim is the fact that the expectation that pregnancy out of wedlock would result in marriage was being outgrown by America as a whole at the time. What this would lead to for black single mothers was the idea that being a single mother was a proactive choice. According to research done by Melvin Wilson in 1995, 62% of single black women said this choice was in response to divorce, adoption, or just non-marriage. Furthermore, for blacks who do marry, the rate of divorce is higher than whites. While the trend is the same for both blacks and whites, with at least half of marriages for the two groups ending in divorce, the rate of divorce tends to be consistently higher for blacks. Overall, blacks are married at a later age, spend less time married, and are more likely to be divorced than whites. While it's true today that marriage plays a big part in avoiding poverty for blacks, there was a time in the US when the opposite was true. In 1880, a census found a positive relationship between the number of black single-parent homes and per capita county wealth. Moreover, literate young mothers in the census were less likely to reside in a home with a spouse than illiterate mothers. This suggests that economic factors following slavery alone cannot account for the family styles seen by blacks, since blacks who were illiterate and lived in the worst neighborhoods were the most likely to live in a two-parent home. Literacy, in that case, was the more significant part of a mother's status than whether or not she was married. It's this knowledge, coupled with the circumstances under which I was raised, that leads me to believe that self-sufficiency, not just marriage, will have a greater impact on elevating black families out of poverty. To that end, if the government takes it upon itself to ensure that blacks, along with the rest of the country, make a living wage and their civil liberties aren't infringed upon, the vicious cycle of poverty that black single mothers have to face will ultimately break. Moving on, Charlie continues his assault on the Great Society by bringing up the negative feedback loop it supposedly created. While the existence of this loop is self-evident, the economic forces that generated it go back further in time than Charlie claims, and stem from an altogether different kind of bad behavior than being a single mother. To understand where the current economic depression of blacks in the inner cities comes from, one must know the ramifications of white flight. White flight is a social phenomenon in which whites in large numbers depopulate communities when a certain threshold of minority residence has been reached. For the purposes of this video, I will be touching on its manifestation in the US from the 1940s to the 1970s. It was during this time, the Second Great Migration, as some call it, that millions of black citizens left the southern United States for the cities of the northern and western United States. While a booming industrial sector awaited them, so too did the racial biases of the residents, the realtors, and even the federal government. Though the Southern model of racial tension wasn't adhered to, these areas had their own playbook for enforcing white supremacy. Among the tactics used were restrictive covenants, declarations within property deeds which forbade the selling or leasing of homes to non-whites. These, coupled with discriminatory zoning laws, led to blacks living in overcrowded, low-income neighborhoods, even when they can afford not to. This made blacks, middle class or otherwise, vulnerable to redlining. Redlining is the denial or financial restriction of services because the prospective area or a person from it is deemed financially risky, usually by banks. While this might not sound like a bad thing on its face, in practice it was both cause and effect in the economic oppression of black people. It started with the homeowners' loan corporations' drawing of residential security maps like the ones on screen. Neighborhoods were rated on a scale of A to D, with A being the best and D the worst. The very presence of non-whites would more often than not elicit a D rating, thus making residents of black neighborhoods unable to secure necessary funds to improve or maintain the condition of their homes. This, in the long term, would cause buildings to fall into disrepair and lead to urban decay. The Federal Housing Administration wasn't far behind in following this racist example. They were so bold in their bigotry that the following quote was included in their underwriting manual in 1938. Recommended restrictions should include provisions for prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. On the other side of the coin were the real estate companies who were willing to help black people move into white neighborhoods, but most certainly not out of the goodness of their hearts. In fact, they would go so far as to pay black people to interact in these neighborhoods and then place their business cards into white people's mailboxes. These manipulative actions would cause white families to sell their homes at a loss out of fear that property values would deteriorate due to the infusion of black residents. Black residents who would then be charged higher than market price for the newly sold homes, leading to a major profit for the real estate companies. The combined methods used by the realtors to achieve this end would come to be known as blockbusting. In the city of Chicago, where the practice is believed to have originated, blockbusting worked like a dream, causing a trend that would eventually shift the city demographics into black and white parity in the present day. By 1950, the Black Belt had expanded to Douglas, the near South Side, and Fuller Park. By 1980, it was no longer a belt. It was a crescent encompassing most of the city's west and south sides, from Madison and Central to 135th and State. This was total ethnic succession. In one generation, a third of the city's communities went from monolithically white to monolithically black. Today, only 21 neighborhoods have white majorities, and only 12 have white populations exceeding the national average of 63%. From bigotry and greed came the acceleration of white flight, and from the mass exodus of whites to the suburbs came the depletion of city funds to build suburban roads. Things got worse when the industrial jobs that once drew blacks into cities by the millions began to leave, causing poverty to become more widespread. Taking the loss of their middle-class tax base into account, cities were put under more financial stress when it came to implementing public assistance programs as they became more economically depressed. All the things I've mentioned, along with other things that I won't get into in this video, led to urban decay. Urban decay, combined with public schools being funded by property taxes and conditioning students to become accustomed to life in prison, led to their underperformance. That underperformance led to the advent of charter schools, which divert public funds away from public schools, leaving them with an economic disadvantage that contributes to a cycle of underperformance. The end result is a negative feedback loop known as brain drain. To end on a semi-related note, I turn my attention toward the matter of free speech on college campuses. What Peterson and Kirk discussed was little different from the dime-a-dozen censorship narrative that we're used to hearing. The reason I'm even bringing it up at all is that the reasons speakers and performers get shut down or disinvited at or from colleges are more diverse than being afraid of letting students be exposed to conservative ideology. There's the case of Anita Alvarez, who was interrupted by protesters over the violence perpetrated against black and brown people in Chicago by the state. The speech was held at a private college. There's the case of Action Bronson, who was petitioned against and ultimately disinvited from 2 colleges over the content of his lyrics and public expressions of transphobia. Both of the colleges are private. There's the case of Reverend James Martin, who was disinvited from speaking because of conservative outrage over a book he wrote concerning outreach to gay and lesbian Catholics. The university he was to speak at is private. Last but not least, there's the case of Chelsea Manning, who was disinvited from speaking at Harvard because of conservative outrage over her being invited in the first place. It's worth noting in this case that the faculty made the decision because of the public perception that being made a visiting fellow to a college is an endorsement from that college. Harvard, as many of you might know, is a private university. Though a public university might in some way be obligated to ensure that someone's freedom of speech isn't infringed upon, a private one, unless it makes its own policy of it, doesn't have to. Even if some of these incidents happened on public campuses, the question could still be raised as to whether the freedoms of peaceful assembly and petition, also guaranteed rights in the US, are a worthy sacrifice to protect it. The greater priority that many so-called free speech advocates miss is that college in this country is becoming less and less accessible in an economy that demands more and more skilled laborers. We must put a higher education within the financial reach of every American willing to accept it, so that we can better fight against poverty. In short, we must turn brain drain into brain gain. Thanks for watching, kindred. Have a nice day.